and thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Ian Scott, and I am the founder of Scott Legal. Today, we're going to spend some time talking about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low or the cases are considered riskier. And we're going to describe that in more detail as we go through the presentation. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know the firm was founded on an E-2 visa 10 years ago, and I'm personally in the United States on an E-2 visa. We've renewed once and we'll be submitting our second renewal in the month of March. So if you do have any questions and want me to recount my personal experience, definitely feel free to contact us. The firm is a full service immigration firm, but we do focus on investor visas, including E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of E-2 visas all around the world, and we do tend to focus on cases that are higher risk, so lower investment amount or have other risk factors. We'll continue this webinar series. We do at least 2 webinars a month. In some months we do 4. I think this month we probably had at least 8 webinars scheduled. After the presentation, we're going to send you a number of things. So one thing we will send you is the actual PowerPoint presentation that we're going to go through. We're going to send you an E-2 visa guide, which is a comprehensive visa guide that goes through all of the E-2 visa requirements and some of the things that we're going to go through today. We're going to send you a link where you can sign up for additional webinars. And also, we're going to send you this webinar because this is actually being recorded, and we will convert it to a YouTube video, and we will send you a link to that so you can watch it at your leisure. And also, what I do encourage you to do is to subscribe to our YouTube channel and hit the notification button. We are constantly posting new immigration videos. We post 3 to 4 a week, and so if you do sign up and also subscribe, if you subscribe and also hit the notification button, you will be notified when we do upload new videos. In terms of our panelists today, you have myself, Ian Scott, and we are also lucky to have Dustin Saldarriaga, who's a fellow Harvard Law School graduate and lawyer and associate at the firm, who is an E-2 specialist as well. And let me turn it over, I believe, to Dustin to go through. Oh, just one last thing. If you do have any questions as we go through the presentation, you can either put them in the chat function or in the Q&A box. We will get to all questions. Sometimes we won't answer them, when you ask them, but we will get to all questions, and there is time saved at the end of the presentation for us to go through any questions that are outstanding. So with that, I will turn it over to Dustin to go through the first few slides.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for being with us for the presentation. So this presentation is first going to walk through the basic E-2 visa requirements, and then as the presentation goes on, we'll highlight some of the aspects that are unique to low investment amounts or otherwise risky applications. So in terms of the E-2 visa requirements, you see on screen the list of those requirements. The first one is that you must be a national of a treaty country. The E-2 visa is a treaty visa. It's not available to everyone in the world, as some visas are. You actually need to be a citizen of a country that has a specific treaty with the United States. Now, as of now, there are about 80 countries on the list, and they are around the world. So there is a good chance that your country of nationality is on the list. 2 notable countries that are not on the list are India and China. So those of you who are citizens of India or China, one option that people do choose is to acquire an additional nationality, oftentimes through investment, and that is a route. So the country that you were born in does not limit your options. What matters here is what country you have a passport from. So if you're able to get a passport from another country that is an E-2 treaty country, you satisfy the nationality requirement. The second requirement on the screen that you see is that you must own at least 50% of the E-2 company. So this is an E-2 investor requirement. You have to be at least a 50% owner. That means that you can be a 50-50 owner with another individual. You do not need more than 50%. 50% is the requirement. You must also make an investment in the business. So the government uses the amount of money that you've invested into the business as a sign of your level of commitment to the business, and that you're actually coming to the US first and foremost to be developing that business. So the funds that you invest as a result must actually be at risk, meaning they must be spent on the business. It's not sufficient to simply transfer your funds into, say, a business bank account, and then to show the government that you have a business bank account with a balance. That money actually has to have been spent on the business, on things such as paying for rent, paying for inventory, paying for equipment, office supplies, potentially paying employees wages, or paying independent contractors to do work for the business. The source of funds, where you got that money from, is also an important aspect of an E-2 application. The government is going to look at the source of funds to make sure that they were acquired legally. So really, this is a quite generous test. And really, the source of funds can be a variety of options. You see a few examples on your screen. It's very common for the source of funds to be from work, earned income from work. It's also common to receive the funds as a gift, can be a gift from anyone. A loan is also acceptable as long as the loan is not secured by assets of the E-2 business. And finally, another common source of funds is when a certain asset is sold. So for example, if someone owns a home or an apartment that they sell, and then they use that money to invest it into the business, that is fine and a common source of funds. Now, in the actual application, you'd need to document that. So to take the example of earned income, what we would typically include is tax returns for that period of earnings, and we'd provide those to the government to show the earnings are legitimate and lawful. The investment must be substantial. So this is actually one of the most common questions we receive related to E-2 visas, which is, how much money do I need to invest in the business? And I see that in the question and answer box, we've actually already received that question during this webinar. The answer is that the government does not provide a specific dollar amount. They don't say, as they would say in an EB-5 visa, that you need to invest $500,000. That's not the way the E-2 visa works. The test is really, and we'll get into more detail on this, the test is, has the applicant invested enough money to make the business operational, given the type of business? And again, we'll get into more detail about what that means. We'll also talk more about what typical expenditures are on E-2 businesses. I mentioned before that it's not enough for the money to sit in a bank account, that it actually needs to have been spent. And you see on screen some very common examples of good expenditures. And again, we'll get into more detail on that in a few slides. The investment is slightly different. You know, the three most common ways that applicants approach the investment aspect of an E-2 application is, first of all, to start their own business, so a startup. And in that case, the test that I mentioned before, where has the person invested enough to make the business operational, that's really the test for a startup. For a franchise, opening a franchise is also one of the three most common ways that people approach an E-2 visa. And there, the test is really, has the person paid what is in the franchise agreement, which is typically defined as the amount that again is enough to get the business operational. And finally, applicants will purchase businesses. So if there's an existing business in the US, say a convenience store, and it already employs 2 or 3 people, a foreign national may look at that business and decide, I'm going to buy either, you know, at least 50% of that business, and that's going to be my basis for the E-2 application. In that case, what is generally the required investment amount is the amount that they pay for the business, assuming that that is the fair market value. So the fair market value of the business is really what defines a substantial investment amount when the business is purchased on the open market. And of course, that amount is tied to the test that it be operational. If it's the fair market value, then presumably that's the amount that's needed to pay for a business that is operational. The fourth bullet on the list you see on screen is that the business cannot be marginal. And what that means is that the business needs to generate enough money, enough revenue to support not only the applicant and their family, but also US workers. This is a requirement of an E-2 visa. What we generally recommend is that within 5 years of operating the E-2 business, it should employ between 3 and 5 full-time US workers. A US worker is anyone who's lawfully able to work in the US. And again, this is full-time equivalent. So, if you have part-time workers that fill that requirement, that's fine. Independent contractors can be used to satisfy the requirement, although the government certainly prefers to see W-2 employees. The fifth requirement is that the business must be real and operating. What that means is essentially you must show the government that if they approve your E-2 visa, you are prepared to come to the US and hit the ground running, begin hiring, begin generating revenue. The E-2 visa is not intended to be used to come to the US to search for opportunities to start a business. You already need to have the business essentially set up and ready to be operational as soon as you receive the E-2 visa. Ways that we would show that in an application are to include documents that include a signed commercial lease, evidence that the company has been established, screenshots showing that the business has a website and is already marketing. And if it's possible, a great way to show that the business is ready to be operating is to show that you're already actually paying workers. If you have a part-time employee or an independent contractor who's doing work, that is very strong evidence to show not only is the business ready to be operational, it's already paying someone. The sixth requirement is that the E-2 investor must be coming to the US solely to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So it is important that the E-2 investor be growing the business, be acting as an entrepreneur or a manager, and that they have the required background to do so. So in terms of the background, there's usually a good amount of room to make the argument that the background that the person has is sufficient to run the business. But you would want to show, particularly if it is a certain type of business, say a pharmacy, that you have a background to do that work. Even if you're doing something that doesn't require a specialized degree, say you're opening a convenience store, it's good to highlight how you have background in managing an organization, in directing employees. Things like that are valuable to show that. And we can speak a little later about how the develop and direct requirement has an important aspect to it if the application is submitted through USCIS, which is if someone's already in the US, they would apply through USCIS, versus if they're outside the US, they would apply through a consulate. If someone's applying through USCIS, USCIS will want to make sure that the applicant is not primarily providing direct services to customers, that they really are developing and directing the business as a business owner. And just real quickly to give an example that I think shows what I mean by that. If someone, say, is opening an accounting firm, they are an accountant themselves, they would want to make sure if they're applying through USCIS that most of their time will not be spent acting as an accountant on behalf of clients. Instead, they would want to show that most of their time is going to be built growing the accounting firm. And that's because USCIS does not want people to enter on an E-2 visa to compete with domestic workers. In this example, accountants who are looking for work. USCIS wants to make sure that the visa is given to people whose real purpose is to grow the business and really act as a business owner and manager. That is less of an issue at consulates. Consulates generally don't make the distinction in the way USCIS does. And finally, you must, as an E-2 investor, have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is not a green card. It does not directly lead to a green card. It is a non-immigrant visa, meaning that you have to convince the government that you will be leaving, returning home at the end of your visa. This is oftentimes a very easy requirement to satisfy. What we would generally include in an application is a signed statement that just explicitly says, I'm applying for an E-2 visa, and I hereby declare my intention to leave at the end of my visa. I should know, if you are renewing your visa, if you've renewed a few times, it might be important to add additional documentation to convince the government that you do have ties to your home country. But in general, that is not a piece of the application that causes concern. So who can apply for an E-2 visa, and how long does the visa last? I'll skim over the points here that I've already discussed, including the first one, non-immigrant visa. It allows nationals of specific countries to come to the US. If you want a list of those 80 countries that I listed, you can Google US Department of State E-2 treaty countries, and you'll see the complete list of E-2 treaty countries. The options for obtaining an E-2 visa, I also touched on. The three main ways that people approach this are either to start their own business in the US, to purchase an existing business, or to start a franchise. And again, there must be a treaty between the US and the treaty country. The E-2 visa, the length of the visa's validity really depends country by country. There is something called reciprocity, and in general, the US will limit the visa's validity period if the treaty country also limits it, and vice versa. So the range is the visa can be issued for as little as 3 months and up to 5 years. So most countries, the visa will be issued for 5 years. And it's important to distinguish the visa validity period from status. To take an extreme example, let's say that you were issued an E-2 visa for 3 months. That means that you essentially have 3 months to enter the US. So let's say you waited until the last day of that 3-month period, you enter the US on that last day, you would then be granted E-2 status for 2 years. Each time you enter the US, you're given status for 2 years. So just because you have a 3-month visa does not mean that you only have 3 months in the US to grow the business. You would actually typically have 2 years on each entry to the US to stay in the US in E-2 status, which means you can develop and direct your E-2 business. If your passport expires before that 2-year period, your stay will likely be limited. And the other thing I should say is that even in countries that generally issue E-2 visas for 5 years, so for example, Canada, if the business is speculative, if the consulate wants to see its progress in a period shorter than 5 years, the consulate has discretion to issue the visa for shorter than 5 years. So we do see some cases where the E-2 visa is issued for, say, 3 years instead of 5. And oftentimes that's because the consulate wants to see that the concept of the business is actually playing out as the applicant intends for it to. How much investment is enough? I mentioned this before on the first screen, that this is one of the most common questions we receive. As I said, there is no minimum dollar amount that the government publishes. It really does depend on the type of business. Ian in the introduction said that he is currently on an E-2 visa. Obviously, his E-2 business is a law firm. Law firms tend to have very low investment amounts to get them operational. You just need a computer or two, you need an attorney, you need some insurance, phone line, internet connection, a website, and that doesn't cost a whole lot of money. Same with, say, a consulting firm. They also have typically very low startup amounts. So for a business like that, the government is not looking for the applicant to have spent a huge amount of money. Instead, what the government is going to want to see is that enough money has been spent to make the business operational. And that could be in the case of a law firm or say a consulting firm, it could be on the lower end of the spectrum. And what I mean by that, in my mind, that is in the $50,000 range. Although again, that's not a hard and fast number. That's just a general concept, a general number that I would tend to look for if I'm working for a client who is starting that type of business. Contrast that to say a manufacturing company, a company that's going to be manufacturing a product, say batteries for electric vehicles. That would require a lot more money to convince the government that we're ready to become operational. That kind of a business might require several $100,000 to get it started. And so the government will want to see, has an amount been invested into this business to make it operational? So you see how it really is a sliding scale. And we call that the proportionality test. The government calls it the proportionality test. Again, when someone's buying a business, so when the business already exists and is not a startup, the test is typically much simpler. If the business is being marketed to the public at large, and the applicant is buying the business, we would call it at an arm's length transaction. So this is not someone with a special relationship to them like a family member. Instead, it's an amount that anyone could pay for the business. That's usually sufficient. If you show the government that you paid the fair market value, the government typically will not ask, why didn't you pay more? So I will pass it off to Ian at this point to talk about strategies to deal with a low investment amount.
Excellent, great. Thank you very much, Dustin. That was a great summary of the different requirements and dealing with what the investment amount should be. And as Dustin mentioned, that's one of the key questions that we get. And I think that one of the things that I always try and say to try and convince clients, or try and explain to clients rather, is that you shouldn't just be focused on a number, right? Because I think that it's a very low investment amount for one person. It may that a fact pattern that slightly differs may mean that one person is successful and the other person is not. And so instead, what I tend to do is, kind of look at a number of different factors and then use those factors to determine whether or not the investment amount is sufficient. So one of the key factors that we look at is what's the overall strength of the E-2 application. So we look at, what are some things that make an application strong? So if you have a lot of clients or people who want to hire your business or prospects, that's going to make an application stronger. If you already have employees, that's going to make an application stronger. Your own background. I know when I went to do my E-2 that the examiner was very impressed with my background, my educational background, and felt that because of my background that I would be able to successfully start a law firm that would hire people. So that's going to be very different from, for example, I did a consult recently with a father who wanted to do an E-2 for his 18-year-old son. So, that's a very, very different fact pattern from someone who has a lot of experience and has a strong educational background. So if, and that's to say that if that 18-year-old wanted to apply for an E-2 visa, we would definitely be looking, at that 18-year-old investing a lot more money than if someone, for example, had a lot of experience, and we could use that to our advantage. Some of the things that we do is we will get letters of intent and or contracts from clients. And also sometimes people can go to their local chamber of commerce and get them to write a letter to say that, hey, I've reviewed the business plan of this business and we believe that this particular business will benefit the local economy. And 9 times out of 10 clients say to us, oh, I can't get that letter. But then tenacity goes a long way, because every single time that a client kind of pushes and kind of speaks to the chamber head more, they're able to get the letter, right? And those letters are very, very helpful for E-2 applications, in particular at certain consulates. Also, if a business is already operational and is taking in revenue, The whole thing with, the key thing to remember is that if the whole reason that the government is looking at the investment amount is because they are interested in seeing, uh, they see a link between the investment amount and the ability to hire U.S. workers. If someone started a business and they invested $15,000 and the business already had 3 or 4 workers, then the investment amount is not going to be that relevant for the consulate. We could submit a very, very low investment amount. We had a case where the person was providing, I think the person was a physician, I'm not sure, a doctor, I'm not 100% sure if they were even a doctor, but had qualifications so that they could provide treatment for people that had a certain neurological disorder. And this particular person had a number of different insurance company contracts. So, it was very, very clear that this business was going to be successful, and that any doctor's office you go into, you see more, typically more than one person working there. And she invested a very low amount, like probably under $20,000 she spent. And we didn't for 1 minute think that that application would be a risky application. Whereas you contrast that to someone who comes in and says, well, I only want to invest or all I have is a certain amount of money, and I only want to invest 25 or $30,000, and I want to do a business startup that I don't have any experience in, and here's my business plan, and my business plan says I'm going to hire a number of people, and I don't have like really any real prospects, but my business plan says that I'm going to hire people. That those two cases are very, very different. And even with the second case with a higher investment amount, that second case is probably going to be a much riskier case. And in terms of like turning this around and saying, like, the title of the slide, how to deal with low investment amount, it is all of these things. It is, you can deal with a low investment amount by hiring employees. You can deal with a low investment amount by getting more letters of intent, having contracts with clients, your business being more advanced, getting a letter from the Chamber of Commerce. Clearly a business plan is going to be key for a startup, but the business plan, at the end of the day, is your projections, and the government knows that. It's a self-created document, and the government is aware of that. So certainly any other objective advice or evidence rather that you have is going to be compelling. The other kind of way to deal with a low investment amount, and this particularly works with USCIS and at times with certain consulates, consulates that aren't as familiar with E-2 visas, is to get a CPA letter. So the CPA can write a letter that says that the applicant has spent everything that's required for this particular type of business. And as I said, that can be very helpful and compelling. And if you do that, you want to include the CPA license as well, and also a description of why the CPA is qualified to give that opinion, right? So like, I'm a CPA as well, but I wouldn't, I haven't done that for ages. So a letter from me probably wouldn't be as useful as a letter from someone who actually is running an accounting firm and looks at businesses on a regular basis. So let's just quickly look at these two examples. I think they're illustrating a lot of the points that I went over, but the first example is clearly an example where even if the investment amount was low, that the applicant would still probably have a very, very good chance of being approved. Whereas the second example, the second example, happens often, right? People who, whether they have the money or not, don't want to spend it, but they want the visa, and that's, nice, but unfortunately it doesn't work that way. And we hear all the time, like, one of the biggest complaints we have from clients, and I understand it, but it doesn't matter, the government doesn't care, is that they're, well, my service oriented business, I only need to spend $5,000. All I need is a laptop and a desk. Now that may be true, right? So I don't disagree with that. That may be true, but it's not going to get you an E-2 visa. Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to spend more money than you would otherwise spend if you were not getting an E-2 visa. I did it myself. I'm not just saying it as a generic, when I applied for my E-2 visa, I signed a 1-year irrevocable lease for $1,700 a month. It was a complete waste of money. I didn't have any clients and didn't need an office, but I think it helped my application quite a bit when I applied. So it's one thing, I think, that unfortunately people have difficulty getting their head around it, but it's just a fact of life when it comes to E-2 with respect to ability to be approved.
Great. Yes. And here on screen, you see common expenditures, and you'll get the impression based on what Ian just said. Clients will often, clients tend to be obviously business savvy. They're wanting to start their own business. And so it's oftentimes, hard for them, understandably, to accept the fact that the government wants them to spend money that just does not make sense from a business perspective. But again, the government uses the amount invested as a test of commitment to the business, as well as wanting to see that workers are going to be employed. And so really underlying everything that you see on screen right now is I think this message. Think creatively about what expenses you can pay for that the business could reasonably need, and that you can use to show the government, look, I'm serious about this business, and I really have spent money on everything that this business needs to become operational. And that really is, again, underlying everything on this list. So let's talk about a few of these. I think it's helpful to think about E-2 expenditures in certain buckets or categories. One category is this first bullet, which is marketing. So have you spent money to really market your business? A website is a great example of that, as are flyers, as are really any initiative. If you want to create business cards, those are very common expenditures. One thing people do, if you're struggling with a low investment amount and trying to figure out how to spend more, websites can often be a way to increase your investment amount. You can create a website for free, but you could also hire a website developer who can create a very polished, attractive website. And those are not cheap. Again, from a business mindset, it doesn't make a lot of sense to spend a ton of money on a website. From an E-2 perspective, though, that is an expense that you can count toward your visa. Another common category is equipment. So you see here the second bullet point: computers, printers, scanners, tablets, iPads, cell phones. These are things, equipment that the business will need to work. If your business sells products, then buying inventory can be important. We recently had a client who is in the coffee roasting business, so it was important to show that they actually are buying coffee beans. Furniture for the business, very common and important expenditure. Trademark, intellectual property, that is something that some businesses, that is relevant to some businesses and not others. This next bullet is a key one: employee payroll or independent contractor payments. If you can think creatively, and if it's feasible for you to already have paid an employee or an independent contractor before you're filing your E-2 application, that can be an enormous benefit, because it not only shows the government that you're paying money, spending money on the business, but it also shows that you're satisfying the marginality requirement, that this is a business that's going to employ US workers. And at the end of the day, as Ian said, that really is what the government cares about. At the end of the day, the consular officer is going to want to feel confident that this is a business that's going to employ US workers. And if they see that it already is, that is one question that the officer doesn't have to worry about. Legal fees are a common expense to include. I would say that they are relatively weaker. So in other words, I would not want that to be the bulk of your investment. I think it's fine for that to be something in addition to the other things on this list. A lease. Ian used, the example that he went through where he paid for his lease in advance. That's a common and a quite smart way to approach this, is to say, I'm going to pay for 6 months or a year in advance. You can include that full amount in your investment schedule. The investment schedule, just to make it clear, is supposed to list things that have already been purchased. It is not projected expenses. So you need to have already spent the money for anything you're putting in your investment schedule. And you also should have documentation of that in the form of receipts and invoices, as well as bank statements and or credit card statements that show that you've actually paid for these items. Other common expenses, business entity setup costs, creating the LLC, creating the corporation, office supplies, training courses sometimes is applicable, licensing fees. The government will want to make sure that you have all of the licenses that are necessary to run the business. Again, they want to see that once they issue the visa, you are ready to hit the ground running, come to the US and actually start running the business. Oh, I'm sorry. Software, and I already mentioned marketing. So I'll touch on the car and truck. Sometimes if the business requires that, that can be a legitimate expense. As an example, we had an applicant who was starting a junk hauling business, so picking up garbage. And so a truck is essential to that business. So she was able to include 2 or 3 trucks that she spent, I believe, $20,000 a piece on. And that counted toward her investment, versus there are other businesses that don't clearly need a vehicle, but people do ask, I'm going to need a car in the US, can I count it? You want to be very careful. If your business does not clearly need a car or truck, you probably should not include it in your investment amount. It just raises questions and looks like you're trying to pad your investment schedule. Okay, what are good versus bad or weak expenditures? I already touched on some expenditures that are good but relatively weaker, such as legal fees. You would certainly want to include legal fees, but you don't want to rely on them. You want to show the government that you have spent the money that is necessary on the variety of items that are necessary to make the business operational. So to that end, some weak expenditures are those that really aren't necessary to the business directly. So if you, for example, travel to the US to scout out opportunities, you're coming to the US to meet with a business broker and to drive around and look at businesses that you might want to buy, that would certainly be a weak expenditure. The money you spent on a flight, on a hotel, on meals, really doesn't directly go toward the business in a way that translates to workers being hired, as opposed to investing in a website, which is going to generate growth, is going to generate clients, generate revenue, which is then going to pay workers. There's a much clearer nexus there between the money that's being spent on the business and employment. Going down the list, all these are quite similar: travel, accommodations, meals, transportation, entertainment, expenses that are reimbursed by a client or customer. Again, you want to show that you've actually committed funds to the business, that these are not funds being reimbursed. And expenses paid to related parties. This does come up. So for example, if your office space is owned by your brother-in-law, and it's clear that you are paying a lease to your brother-in-law, the government, the consular officer, could reasonably ask, is that money that is actually being committed to the business, or is that money that eventually might find its way back to you? And so making sure that you're engaging in arm's length transactions with unrelated parties is important. Now, that's not to say that you can't engage in transactions with family members. It's just to say that if you're doing that, you want to be aware that it could raise questions, and you want to make it especially clear that you really are developing a business that is legitimate and that will, again, employ US workers. All right, I will go ahead and pass it back to Ian to talk about common challenges.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dustin. So, I think that some of these things we covered as Dustin covered as he went through the presentation. But and I kind of echoed the same thoughts when I went through slide 5. But I think that people, one of the things that always happens, or one of the questions that we always get is, oh, well, all these other lawyers tell me that I have to spend over, $100,000 to get an E-2 visa. And I think that, you absolutely don't, right? I think that the purpose of this presentation is not to discourage people that, like, if you have low investment amounts, that that you shouldn't apply. In fact, we encourage it. We encourage you to apply, but it's just, we encourage you to apply. However, we encourage you to do the things that I went over on that slide, right? Like whether hire employees, kind of whether it's getting letters of intent, or getting Chamber of Commerce letters, etc. So because as I said, that the example that I used earlier is that we often get the comment that, well, I don't need to spend any more money, but unfortunately, because I only have a consulting business, but unfortunately, unfortunately you do. Similarly, as Dustin had mentioned as well, that putting money in a bank account or spending money on things that a consulate is going to find irrelevant, right? For the purposes of the business, like, if someone has a consulting business where they're saying that their premises for consulting is a particular office, like buying a car, the government may not feel that that actually is something that is you're purchasing for the successful operation of the business, but rather you're purchasing it for yourself. Whereas the examples that Dustin used, where it made complete sense that the business needed those items to operate. And I think that one of the other strategies that we take when we're looking at consulting businesses or service oriented businesses is we ask the applicant to spend in a wide range of categories, because really what we want to do, like, so marketing, equipment, furniture, rent, so they're really, what we can say to the officer is that the person has done everything that they need to set up this particular type of business, even if though they may have spent not as much, but they've spent in a number of different categories. Because when you contrast two cases, like one case, for example, where let's say that someone spends $100,000 on leased premises, like let's say they prepay their lease for 4 years or something like that, and spent very little on equipment, very little on any other things that are needed to get the business up and running, but they spent $100,000 on rent. That is not a good E2 visa application, right? Because I think that often, a lot of the time, clients are looking at just an amount, right? Just to, like, this is the amount that I need. But if you are doing a consulting business, you definitely want to spend over a wide range of areas. I think that one of the things also to look at in this, I think empathy is always, it's something to consider. But a lot of the time, and I think this was definitely the case when I applied, is kind of what would the consular officer be thinking about the particular case. The person behind the desk is not a finance person, is not necessarily even a business person, and also is not necessarily a lawyer, and probably is not a lawyer. So a lot of the times you're thinking of what is it, like, sometimes it's good to think of what is it that, if you were in their shoes, what is it that would convince you that that the visa should actually be issued. And sometimes these are, sometimes these can really be common sense things, and sometimes relate back to the things that that I talked about. And then the last bullet point just really gets at what I started with, really, was that you kind of want to spend in a number of different categories to show that you have spent in enough areas to make the operation of the business successful. Like, and I can't stress enough that often we get clients who want to do the minimum, right? They don't want to spend the money. They have a computer already and maybe a cell phone, and they want to just kind of say that's enough or whatever, right? But those can be recipes for disaster, just denial, right? Because the time for, like, the best foot forward is when you first apply for it. And often when an examiner, like, they do the pre-screening and they look at the case, and they just see, a low investment amount, their first impression might be that this is a low investment amount, right? That the first impression may not be as good. You contrast that to someone who is doing an E2 visa and they spent $200,000, and often they've already passed a significant hurdle, right? They still have to meet the other requirements, but they've already passed a significant hurdle. So Another area, a challenging area that comes up for clients is E-2 visas that deal with real estate investment. So let's just talk about this more generally before we get into the bullet points. The issue often here is that examiners tend to look at this real estate businesses. As soon as real estate is mentioned or it's implied, the examiners tend to look at this and think that it's a passive business. So let me give you an example of a client that came to us. This was a client, I can't remember if he prepared his application on his own or he used another lawyer, but he purchased one house. The house had a mortgage, so we won't even get into that. But let's just say he purchased the house outright, and let's just leave it at that. And he went to the consulate and he said, "I'm doing a home flipping business, and I've already purchased a house. I've spent $700,000 on it." You know, this example is pretty close to what actually happened. In terms of that was his equity in the house anyway. And I'm going to buy more houses and I'm going to flip them and turn this into a business. And can you give me the visa? He went to the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt and they said no, and they denied him. And that's, you know, when then he came to us, and we would never ever have filed that application, because it's clear to us that that would be denied. And the reason is because it's a passive business. You don't need a visa to do that, right? What he's doing, what he was doing, you know, you don't need, if you're buying one house in the US and you want to get renovators to fix it up and flip it, that's passive. It's like it's close to buying stock. We're going to talk about equity investments in a second, but it's close to buying stock. So part of the, like, you know, some of it just has to do with the perception. And as soon as real estate becomes you know, in the mix, like, you know, we do get a lot of people say, I want to do a home flipping business, I want to do a property management business, etc. And it just, I think it does become harder. The other kind of issue with a home flipping business is because we do have some clients that have E2s with home flipping businesses, but they really require a significant amount of inventory, right? So the one I'm thinking of, you know, they probably have 100 homes, right? So it really does require a significant amount of inventory for the business to actually be considered an E2 business. Because at the end of the day, one of the reasons that the examiners will not approve a home flipping, the first example, or they didn't approve that client's case, was because you know, it's passive, and they feel that you're not going to have sustainable employees. So that client did come to us, and we were refiling his E2 application, but then he won the visa lottery, so so he has a green card now. So so you know, if you just have like a real estate holding company, you know, wouldn't qualify. If the company's just kind of holding, you know, real estate, that's not going to qualify, because it's not going to require, probably not going to require any employee. Similarly, purchasing a property and, you know, putting in the name of an LLC doesn't qualify. A lot of people ask that question. The question is, oh, if I buy, because some countries do have that, right? If you know, give you visa status just based on buying a home in the country. Well, this country doesn't, unfortunately. And you know, and again, the third bullet point challenge is demonstrating that it's a real and operating business, and that really means you know, hiring employees. Other types of you know, real estate businesses that could work, you know, real estate brokerage firms. We've done a number of those. So people who are able to get their brokerage license, and they basically say that they're going to have a brokerage firm and then hire other real estate agents to sell property. So that could work. Real estate management companies can work as well. But again, it's similar to the last point of house flipping. It may work, but it definitely has to be on a large enough scale so that you can show that it's going to be employees, that you're going to have employees. And then the final point is and this is what we always encourage people to do when they are doing real estate flipping. When they come to us and say, we want to do flipping, we suggest that they position the application as a real estate renovation construction company, because that doesn't require you to buy any properties, right? Like, that's a thriving business and it doesn't require you to buy any properties. The investment amount is going to be a lot lower. It's going to be getting you know, tools and things that are needed. You're going to have a business plan that says you're going to hire other contractors, plumbers, electricians, other people to do work. And you know, it avoids some of the issues of you know, if you say that your business is buying property and then, like, the property sitting and then appreciating and then selling. So that, you know, that has been successful. The one thing you do have to keep in mind, though, if you do a real estate renovation construction company, is you do have to make sure that you have the license from the state or county. Usually the license is not that difficult to get, but it's in particular if you're applying through USCIS, that license is going to be required because they will ask for it, and they may even know. It doesn't take them long to figure out which counties require a license. So. This is a lot of the comments that I had for real estate companies. They're applicable to equity trading companies as well, because they too can be seen as passive. Now, another couple of considerations here, though, is that if you're just trading your own stock or stock of your family, that's not ever going to be considered an E2 business, or probably not going to be considered an E2 business. And really, what can work for an E2 business, though, is we've done lots of hedge funds, we've done people who are setting up trading companies. If you're trading on behalf of other people, and and it rises to a large enough scale, when you look at large investment banks, that's what they do for a living, and they have a lot of employees. So that's definitely, it is possible, but you just have to show that you are going to be that you're managing other people's money. If not, they'll just think you're day trading or trading on your own behalf, and they'll think that you don't need a visa for that, and it's too passive. And then the other thing to keep in mind is this is another area, like consulates and USCIS don't typically tend to ask for licenses for everything, but for these two areas they tend to focus on a license, saying we want proof that you are able to operate this business, and show us a license. So these industries are highly regulated. So definitely you want to be clear that they're able to do whatever it is they need to do. So now let's look at reasons for E2 denial. So, low investment amount is one. Of course, we've talked about that at great length, but that, and that this is in particular, if it ties into bullet point 3, there are some consulates where, you could not even dream of going in with under $100,000, unfortunately, right? There's just some consulates that will not accept lower investment amounts. You have to speak with your immigration lawyer and kind of get an understanding of where you can apply, because sometimes you may have an option with respect to where you apply, but low investment amount is definitely one reason. I mean, that's a good reason to be denied. Good in the sense that if you do have additional funds, it's an easy one to remedy because you can spend more and reapply. Sometimes the nature of the business, we talked about real estate businesses and equity businesses, equity trading businesses. That's what that bullet point is getting at. Filing, location, venue. There are just some consulates that are very difficult. And it's unfortunate, but there just are. And there's some consulates we would do anything we could not to send the applicant to that particular consulate. This is being recorded, so I won't explicitly talk about those consulates or name them, but it's definitely something you want to talk about with your immigration attorney, because generally speaking, although the standard is the same, the application and adjudication vastly differs between consulates. There are some consulates that know E2 visas really well and are very predictable, like London and Toronto. They're both great consulates for E2 visas. They understand the law really well and apply the law really well. But then unfortunately, there are consulates that don't do a lot of E2 visas, and sometimes it is a challenge to, even some consulates, if you go to their own websites and they have incorrect and factually incorrect information about E2 visa and E2 visa law. So. Another big reason for denial is that the person has a business in their home country that's not doing well or doesn't have employees. We had a client in London who had an IT consulting company. We warned him that this would and probably would be a big issue, but we just didn't think it would be as big an issue as it was, because the consulate did their own independent research about the company, because we obviously didn't include much information on the company in the UK, and they did their own independent research on the company in the UK and saw that he had the company for 15 years without ever hiring an employee, and he wanted to do the same business in the US. So that's a very, very difficult thing to overcome. So a common reason for denial. A concern that the business isn't going to create U.S. jobs, and sometimes this can be from for a number of reasons. They can look at your business plan and think that it's unrealistic. We had one client who was a management consultant. When he went to his interview, and they said, "What's your business?" and he kind of deer in headlights expression of his description, not mine. So and that's bad, because if you are a management consultant, the officer may think that you're not going to be able to attract and clients such that you're able to hire U.S. workers. So the other is issues with the adjudicating officer. So it's always best to be cordial. Sometimes the officers can be, irritating. Sometimes they can be rude even. But being rude back or being dismissive is not going to help your case at all. Best to just be deferential and try and get as much information as you can. Try to get them to approve it, but to try and get as much information as you can, so that if you do have to reapply, you can, because unfortunately there's no appeal process at consulate, so whatever they decide is the final answer. And then the other reason is that you don't meet the requirements. So we have this a lot, where clients come to us and they say, "Oh, I went to the consulate and I was denied," and then we look at their file and they were ineligible. So the example that I used before about the gentleman who went to the U.S. consulate in Frankfurt, not only did they deny because they thought it was a passive business, but also the property had a mortgage on it, and that is not allowed for E-2, right? So it's not permitted. So it's in the regulations. It says that the assets of the business cannot be security. So he was not eligible. He didn't meet the requirements of an E-2, and that happens more often than you think, especially when people either do applications on their own or use lawyers who don't understand the requirements. Okay, now, just to look at some hot topics. Biden administration has been in power for a while now, and I would say that in the last administration I would not say that they were immigration friendly necessarily, but I'd say that with E-2s, even in the last administration, there wasn't a significant change, I don't think, in terms of the way they were adjudicated. So we haven't really seen a change in the approval rates with respect to E-2s. E-2 visas often get approved. The government published approval rates are, I believe, over 80%, 81% or so, and the firm's approval rates are closer to the 98% mark, although past results don't predict future outcome. Unfortunately, one adjudication trend that is COVID related is, the consulates are slow. They're speeding up, but in Toronto, in the past, you could get your interview about a month after you applied. In London, maybe 2 months after you applied, but Toronto, you're probably looking at 6 months out, and London, probably 3 to 6 months. I'm not sure the exact timing in London, but definitely long waits for E-2s. And that's why we're seeing a lot more USCIS filings, because people can't wait. So they're in the US maybe, and they do the USCIS filing. This is again kind of relates to COVID. Most consulates are open again. There are still a few where they're not, or they're still doing U.S. citizen processing, or very limited visa processing, but but it's definitely improving, and it's something you kind of have to constantly check with your immigration attorney to see what's happening at the consulate. The major consulates like London, UK, etc., still London in the UK, and Toronto, the ones that are regularly process E-2 visas, those are backlogged. The ones where you can actually often get applications processed quickly are ones that don't. Dustin had an application that he did a few months ago I guess it was several months ago now, but in 2021 in Vietnam. And Vietnam is not a treaty country, but the applicant was living there. And it was quick, like, it was the height of the pandemic, but the consulate was open and he was able to get an appointment. That same person, if they applied in the UK, I think would have been, waiting for many months. So that worked out well. And as the other trend is just that we really are seeing a strong uptick in applications filed through USCIS rather than the consulate, just because of the wait time. So and just kind of to go through some more things that just kind of tend to come up with E2s and complex areas. People ask, do you have to hire employees before you apply? You don't have to. It will help your application, but you don't have to hire employees before you apply. I'd say the majority of our clients have not hired employees before they apply, but it can be helpful for an application. Source of funds, this is an interesting topic, and there are actually a few source of funds questions, so I'm going to go through them as I answer this question. But when you apply to consulate, we don't pay that much attention to source of funds. So source of funds, the requirement is you have to prove that the money came from a legitimate source. Now, when we're applying at a consulate, they don't tend to focus on this very much. So we just explain where the money came from. So we might say that the money came from the person's savings, and we might include like the first couple of pages of the person's tax return, but to show that they could have saved that money. But if you're applying through USCIS, unfortunately, they're not going to be satisfied with the first two pages. They'll want the entire tax return for a few years, enough time to show that you could have saved the money. Then they'll want to see that you were able, that the money actually went into the bank account where you transferred the money from, and you accumulated it over time. So now that's a simple source of funds, but often people's source of funds is not simple. So when you're applying through USCIS, it can be quite an exercise pulling together the information. And with that, I want to touch on one of the questions that came up related to source of funds. So the question was, can the source of funds be a crypto exchange platform? Example, money was transferred from bank account for the purposes of buying crypto. The crypto is sold and the funds transferred back into the original bank account. A hard wallet was not used. So let's talk about that. So crypto, exchange, it's kind of new to most people. It's certainly new to USCIS. But, I just think about this as the person's buying or selling security, like buying and selling stock or something like that, right? So, this example says the money was transferred from a bank account for the purposes of buying the crypto, right? So the people don't get confused, for the purposes of buying stock. It's just the same thing. They're buying something on a reputable exchange. So, assuming this exchange you bought it on is reputable, and hoping that it goes up so you can sell it and make money, right? So with source of funds, if you were doing USCIS in particular, you would have to show where the money that you came from, that you transferred from your bank account to buy the crypto, right? So that's the kind of the first thing, and depending on where that came from, you would have to provide additional evidence. I'm not sure if the person's going to start writing where it came from, but that we won't be able to kind of go through specific examples of all of the aspects. I'm just going through this question to illustrate the point. Then, as long as its exchange is a reputable exchange, you could show the details of the money going into the crypto account, the money appreciating, the particular item appreciating and being sold, and then details of it being transferred back into your bank account. So that tracing of the funds is going to be very, very important. Another question that came with respect to source of funds, it's can the investment be from a loan from a bank? And that's the next kind of bullets on the slide. So it absolutely can be, and that's a simple source of funds, right? So if you get a bank loan, like let's say you have an unsecured line of credit or a secured line of credit, and the line of credit is secured against your personal assets, and you take that money out, that's a simple source of funds, because that's all you have to show is the money coming out. Now, the problem is that the security for the loan can't be the business or any assets of the business. That's what the issue is for any loan, but generally speaking, a loan can be used. The other question that comes up sometimes is E2 for two investors. It's no problem. You can get an E2 for two investors where you have 50-50 ownership. That's no problem. Substantive changes to E2 after filing. This is another area that comes up where people, they say, oh, I want to do a consulting business, and they get an E2 for consulting business, and then they stop the consulting business and then start a restaurant. Well, you can't, unfortunately, you can't just do that. There's things you have to do. You can do it, but there are things you have to do before you do it. So if you do change the business significantly, substantively from what you said it was going to be, then you definitely have to take a look at that. It's, like I said, you can get through it, but you should definitely have to speak to an immigration lawyer. Family business purchases, this is another area that can, very complex, where, like, if you're buying something, a business from a family member, the government often will believe that there's no real transaction going on. So there's often a lot of additional documentation, and or, like, for example, normally when you're buying a business, you wouldn't have to get the business valued, right? You just, like, the market price is what the person asks, what you guys agree on. But if you're buying it from your family, then the government may not believe that it's a substantial amount, just because it's money being transferred around family. So something to consider.
Perfect. And with that, I think we are in our question and answer portion. So Ian, just to confirm, I assume we're going till 10:15?
Exactly. Yeah.
Perfect. So we have about 10 minutes. Number of great questions have rolled in. Ian, I don't know if there's a specific way, if you saw any others that you wanted to highlight. I'm happy just going down the list if that sounds good to you.
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay, so Sophia has asked, if one is interested in starting a business within the healthcare human services sector, and the income source is not from clients directly, could the E-2 business be paid via government sources such as Medicaid or Medicare? Ian, I'm happy to answer or to defer to you, whatever
Yeah,
you prefer.
I mean, I think if the question is just saying if the revenue source is coming from the government, I don't see a problem with that. If like, let's say, for example, that someone, because, and I think this is the example, but if not, then I don't, but I think, let's say someone was getting an E-2 and they were a doctor, and that all of their clients that they were servicing were people who obtained Medicare. Is that right? I'm not sure. Medicare, Medicaid, I always mix them up. Me not being American or anything. So let's say they and that was the all of the revenue was coming from that, because those were the only types of patients that the doctor saw. I don't see any issue with that, as long as the business was one that could hire employees, because the revenue source itself, I don't think, is going to be that relevant.
Perfect. And another question came in that is related, I think, to a couple other questions. This is the question is, I am a Canadian citizen and an owner-operator truck driver in Canada. I want to have a trucking business in the US, but we'll need to start with one truck and grow from there. Can I drive that truck with an E-2 visa, or do I need to hire another driver? So the general idea here is, for many startups, the E-2 investor applicant may be the first and only employee at the beginning of that business. How does that work with the requirement that you need to employ workers? If this is an application that's being filed with USCIS, I would say it's especially important early on to hire someone who will be driving trucks in addition to yourself. I think it's okay if you are driving a truck, but the earlier you can show that you're going to have another truck driver at the business and that you're going to grow from there, that will be something that USCIS will want to see, because certainly you've identified one of the key risks here, which is that the government will worry that this is a business that will only have you driving a truck and not necessarily growing the business and hiring other workers. And again, that's a principle that's broader than just obviously your business. I used the example of the accounting firm earlier. What we did with that application, where the investor applicant was the accountant, we worked with her to make sure that she hired at least one part-time worker early on who could provide direct services to clients as a second accountant, so that we could make the argument to USCIS that the E-2 investor applicant is going to have the bandwidth to actually focus on managing the business and developing and directing it, rather than just providing the direct service. Ian, I don't know if there was anything you wanted to add.
No, I think that's good. I think that's great. And because we've done a lot of trucking E-2s, and in all cases, on application date, the applicant had more than one truck. So that's, because if you only have one truck and you're a truck driver, then unfortunately, you'll probably go into the interview and they'll think that that's what your plan is, right? Is to get an E-2 visa and basically drive the truck yourself. And so in all cases, the applicants have had more than one truck on application date.
Perfect. Another question that I think is part of a theme that I've seen among the questions. Once I set up my business in the US, can I start operating it and generating revenue before my E-2 visa is approved? The answer is that if you are not within the United States physically, there's really not a problem to owning a business in the US and having it get started. So let's say you're Canadian and you're starting a franchise in the US, or you've purchased half of a franchise in the US and that franchise already is operational, say, absolutely no problem to buy 50% of it, and to employ workers, generate revenue, and to take all of that information to the consulate and show them this business has been operational. What you want to be very careful of is if you enter the US and you're physically present in the US while you have an operating business, you must have work authorization if you're working in the US. And work is defined by the government not simply as receiving money. So even if all earnings are being retained by the company, if you're in the US, say on a B1 visa, and every day you're going into the business and from 9 to 5 you are directing workers, the government can still say you are working and you're working without authorization. So there are very specific business activities that you can engage in without working in the US, say on a B1 visa. And we have blog posts on that question. USCIS has a page on exactly that question. But if you're physically in the US, do be cautious that you don't cross that line into unauthorized work.
Dustin, one thing, if we could move to Sarah's questions, just because she had sent them beforehand.
Oh,
She
perfect.
sent them yesterday, actually, so I just want to make sure we get through all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. So I see it's a list. Were there any specific ones? So
I think, yeah, some of them will be very quick. So I think so.
perfect. So yeah, so the requirements for an E-2 visa when a business is acquired franchise from a US citizen, really just what we talked about earlier in the presentation. So you can certainly own and purchase a franchise from a US citizen, or really from anyone. You would have to be at least 50% owner, and you presumably would be paying the fair market value for that franchise. When the business is an e-commerce project with intention to start.
I think it's the same. I think I think the point for the first two questions is anything qualifies for E2 that's a legitimate business that will hire US workers. So then the answers go like the first slide Dustin went through, it has to meet those requirements.
Perfect.
3 we've done it. We've talked about that. So,
yeah, and then 4, I think, is getting into the question of EB5 and using the E2 as a bridge. So I would just say we actually have a separate webinar on green card options, and we specifically talk about green card options that might be available to E2 investors. So please visit our YouTube channel. That is an entire webinar on that topic. What if it wants to upgrade to EB5? Same answer. What is the procedure to start with the visa? So should the business be registered and operating? Yes, typically the first step is to set up a business entity. It's quite easy to do that. Can take as little as a day, frankly, to set up the LLC. If you're able to open a business bank account for that business. If you cannot open a business bank account, then to begin paying from your personal account on business expenses that are necessary for the business. Keep all documentation. And really that starts building the application, where you can say the entity exists, I've spent money on it, here's all the documentation of the money I've spent. And from there, if you're able to employ an independent contractor or a worker, that's great. You can speak with a firm really at any stage of the process. Obviously, it's easier speaking with an attorney early so that we or whatever attorney you work with can work with you through the process. But that's really typically how to get it started. How will the person be running the company if the visa is not approved? It's possible to run it from abroad. There was another question about, certain things might not be possible without being in the US, such as purchasing a vehicle. That is true. So we do have certain applicants who they do absolutely everything they can, but there might be certain pieces that they just can't accomplish from abroad. Purchasing a vehicle is one that I've seen. Opening a business bank account could be difficult without being in the US. I have heard that, although other clients are able to do that. It's okay to have an application where there are certain very discrete and specifically defined items that you're able to take care of as soon as you come to the US. You would want to frame it that way in your application. You would want to have a very good explanation about why you weren't able to do it before and how you're going to accomplish it as soon as you get to the US. And in general, that wouldn't be an issue unless it really is a key piece of the application. So for example, we talked about licenses. If you're opening a pharmacy and you don't have the license to run a pharmacy or be a pharmacist, the consulate's probably not going to accept the argument that that's something you'll take care of when you get to the US. So be mindful of that. All right, can one investment be shared by two E-2 visas? The answer is yes. The overall investment amount needs to be sufficient for the business to be operational. So if you have two investors, it is okay for that investment amount to be divided between them. Our general recommendation is that the investment amount be split about evenly if both investors are applying for E-2 visas. And dependence on the E-2 visa application. So dependents are fine. The spouse of an E-2 visa holder is able to work as of earlier this year without an EAD, employment authorization document. So you do not need a separate work permit as an E-2 spouse to work in the US. Children cannot work, however, they can study in the US. And I am looking at the time. Ian, did you see any other questions that you wanted to make sure to
I think
touch
no,
on?
I think those are I think one here is that can the applicant be on a salary? You can if you are, if you have the E-2, you can certainly be on a salary because you're working for the company. Um, there's one here, would the investment funds be required to pay the salary of not really. There's no kind of that is the question is, would the investment funds be required to pay a salary of approximately 2 to 3 times employees that is required or encouraged? Not really. The investment amount looks at a bunch of things, but it's the business plan itself is actually going to look at whether or not the business is going to be able to support U.S. workers. So that's and I think and I think there may be one or two other questions outstanding, but we will end it here. And no, the spouse is not. There's one last question: is the spouse of an E-2 visa holder limited to working only in the E-2 business? No, the spouse can get EAD and work anywhere. So it's almost like a green card in terms of authorization. So
Right, and just related to that one, another question was, can the principal, the E-2 investor, work for another business? The answer is no. The E-2 investor needs to focus on the E-2 business itself.
Exactly. Excellent. No, thank you very much, Dustin. It was great. And thank you everyone for joining. As I said, we'll send you out a copy of this video in terms of a link to the YouTube channel. As Dustin mentioned, there are a few, there are many other YouTube webinars. One in particular that, some questions came up with respect to moving from an E-2 to an EB-5. There's a specific webinar on that, moving to E-2 to different green cards. And we talk specifically about EB-5. So I think some of those questions will be answered there. You'll get the guide and you'll get a link to future webinars. And yeah, so it's definitely thanks again, everyone, for coming, and we'll see you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.